Hello neighbors, it's Brad here at eTrailer, and today we're taking a look at installing the Blue Ox base plate for a 2016 Ford F-150. Now this is what your base plate is going to look like when it's installed, and overall this is a really clean system because it just replaces where those factory tow hooks were. And when not towing, you can simply pull your arms out, and this is going to give it an even cleaner look. Now this is what it's going to look like when you're not flat towing, and even though you lose your factory tow hooks, it really doesn't matter that much because you can still use your safety chain loops here from the base plate as your tow hooks. And overall it sits pretty nice in just that pocket where those tow hooks were. So as far as the fascia, the only trimming that you may or may not have to do is mounting up the rest of your components. It does come with a bracket to mount up your 6-pole. You may or may not have air brakes. As you can see, we have our air fitting here. I just decided to kind of use this section here because we don't have the adaptive cruise control, and it makes mounting up a little bit easier. Also, you're not going to block any airflow to the intercooler. When you are ready to hook up to flat tow, pretty easy. You're just going to push the arms in, and as you twist, should hear that lock in place, and you're ready to go. Removing is just the same. You just pull this pin, twist it, and these come out. So gives you a nice clean look, and it's super easy to get this ready to hook up to your tow bar. And we're using a Blue Ox tow bar here, so it's already ready to drop into our Blue Ox style arms. Now, if you are using a different style tow bar, and not to worry, you can still hook up to here. A lot of times you can find adapters that are going to allow you to still hook up. That way you can use any brand of tow bar and still be able to hook that into place with these arms. So we'll just go ahead, get our pins in place. And we'll go ahead and do the other side. Now we'll just get the rest of our components hooked up. So we have our safety cables here, which you can see our loops are right where we need them. Also get our diode wiring hooked up. Our breakaway switch. And you may or may not have air brakes. So this one here, we do have our air fitting. Beginner installation, we're going to be pulling off this plastic fascia piece here, and it is all one part. So be careful as you kind of snap this. It kind of gets a little bit thin here in the center, but your best bet is to kind of just work here on this center section. We're going to find a series of clips as we do this. So just slowly kind of putting pressure here. Sometimes it's helpful to have a plastic trim tool. Once you kind of get a gap, you can work around here and just kind of pry at it, and that way you're not marring up your paint or plastic here. So just kind of work your way around, and you're going to find a series of clips as you go. So I got this side off. I'm going to go ahead and get this side popped off as well. Now there's also clips here where our license plate is, and we might even be able to pinch these. There's little locking tabs, so just kind of pinch in the center as you're giving it kind of pressure, and that's going to allow these to pop out. So I'll just use my fingers here, little pop, little pull, and it should all come off. We can go ahead and set this aside. Now you can see some of our clips stayed here in the bumper. The other ones are actually on the tabs from the plastic. Doesn't matter which way they go, just make sure that you hold on to those. That way it snaps back into place later on. And if your truck is equipped with adaptive cruise control, you're also going to remove that. It should be a series of 11mm nuts, and normally it's located here on the driver's side. So ours doesn't have that, so what we're going to do is take our 21mm socket, and we're going to head underneath to the back side to gain access to the bolts where the bumper's actually mounted on. If you go underneath your truck, you're going to see on the outside of the frame rail, there's going to be a 21mm nut that's tucked back there. There's also going to be one on the other side, so we'll go ahead and get those removed. Now in the instruction manual, they say there's a plastic push pin in the center here where the valance kind of meets that lower portion. I found a pin, but it seems like it slides out, not a plastic push pin per se. So if yours has that, you're going to want to remove that. I can't seem to find ours, so I'm going to continue on, and if we find that later, we can remove it. So we're going to go to these front nuts here. Again, it's going to be a 21, so we'll go ahead and get these removed. Our bumper should be ready to come off. Your tow hooks are going to kind of pull through this section, but this whole thing should come off. Now, something you're going to want to take care of is going to be the fog lamps. They're going to be plugged in, so we don't want to just pull our bumper back as those are going to be attached. We don't want to damage those. So as we kind of lift the bumper up here, we'll kind of pay attention to where our wiring plug is. So as we kind of remove this, we do see our wiring there, and it does have plastic pins here holding it on. So I'm going to go ahead and release these. It's going to give us a little bit more room to work with while we unplug these. And then you just follow this. You're going to see our fog lamp tab. So we should be able to kind of just separate these clips here and get this off. There we go. So you can just see our tabs here are kind of what's holding on. So if you pry those up, it should pop out. We're going to have the same thing on the other side, so go ahead and do that. We can go ahead and set our bumper in a nice safe place. We're going to go ahead and just remove the covers here on our tow hooks, and they just slide off just like that. So you can pull both of them off and set them aside. Now we need to remove our tow hooks, and there's just going to be two 15mm bolts that we can see poking through here. We'll grab our nut plate and we're going to repeat on the other side. Grab each side of our base plate, and this is just going to kind of slide right where those tow hook mounting holes were. And when we get this in place, we're going to be sliding these up through the bottom and then finishing them off with the nylon lock nuts. So before we do that, we want to get our hardware set up. We have a split washer and then a flat washer, and that's going to pass up, and then at the top we'll have our nylon lock nuts. Now before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit of thread lock on here, and that's just going to kind of make sure that it's going to stay on long term, not going to loosen up over time. So getting this in place, I'm going to just drop these in and then just kind of hold these here with my hand and then slide them up. And while doing that, I'm going to go ahead and grab my nylon lock nuts, and as long as I get them slightly hand tightened on, that's going to at least hold this up for us. And then we're going to go ahead and tighten this down. So these are going to be a 3/4 inch socket that we're going to use on the bottom while holding the nut on. Normally I'd like to tighten on the nut side here, but it's going to be a little bit easier to draw this up with a socket. And while doing this, you can see it can kind of slide. You want this against the frame rail here on the side as square as possible, so just make sure that that's sitting against that as you tighten it up. We want these nice and tightened and torqued down, and that way this is pressed against the side because we're going to be drilling in that frame rail, so really just make sure that that's nice and flat against it. And then we're going to come back with our torque wrench here, and just using the torque settings found in the instruction manual, we'll get these torqued down properly. Now if you need a torque wrench, we have these available here at eTrailer. You can generally rent them at an auto parts store. But this is going to make sure that these are going to be tight enough to not become loose over time, but also that they're not going to be too tight, putting stress on the threads. So if you need to, you're going to want to always generally torque on the nut side. So I have a wrench underneath here holding the bolt head as I torque this down. See on the side plate the two holes, and we're going to be drilling through that, and a 3/4 inch drill bit should work pretty well here. I always kind of keep my bolt handy that we'll be passing through just to make sure that I have it all cleaned up for those threads to pass in. We'll go ahead and get these drilled through. So I've got these drilled out. I can pass my bolts through without it catching on the threads too much here. So I'm going to go ahead and get some Loctite on here. And we have a split washer that that's going to be on the outside portion, and then it's going to be tying into these nut plates here. So we'll do our farther one here first. Just going to hold that in place, get some threads started just by hand. And then once that's torqued down, to remove this, you can kind of do two things. You can kind of just wobble this back and forth, and eventually that little weld will pop off. It may take a little bit. Other option is you can cut this with some wire cutters, or even using a flathead screwdriver and a hammer sometimes just kind of pry that, and it should pop that weld. So we got this taken off. We're going to go ahead and repeat the same process on the front hole here, and then the whole other process is going to be repeated on the other side. Now with both of them installed, we're going to go ahead and get our safety cables here wrapped around them, and this is just going to be in case of a accidental disconnect or these failing. This is just going to make sure that this is wrapped around the frame, holding it on. So there's actually a few spots here that we're able to put our quick link on to make our connection. But the main thing we're going to want to do is get this to be wrapped around our frame rail here, and that way it kind of holds it all together. So there's many different ways you can do this, but I think if we just kind of go through, and if I can, I'm going to try to wrap it around this subframe as well, just to kind of give it a little extra lateral holding. Sometimes it can get a little bit tight here, but we are going to need to tighten down this collar. And we'll just go ahead and repeat on the other side. So with both sides tightened and torqued down, our base plate is essentially complete. Now before we put our fascia back on though, we're going to want to actually leave that off if you're doing the rest of your flat toe components. And the reason being is you're going to be running a lot of wires from the front, and having the fascia off is going to allow you to get that clean run that you want. Now also included is going to be the bracket for your 6-pole, and this is going to mount up on the bumper. So my suggestion is wait to mount this on until you have all your wiring in place and you get the bumper back on. But generally pick a side, whatever, if you want it on the passenger or driver to run your wires, and then from there you can kind of start running them here and just leave yourself a little bit of length here, and that way you can make your connections a little bit easier. Now as far as getting our front bumper back on, it's just going to mount up just as we took it off using those plates that we have. We have the studs there, and it's going to use the factory hardware. So we're just going to kind of slide this over, and you're going to see where the base plate is. That's where our tow hooks originally were. So just make sure, you may have to push that nut plate in from the back to get these studs to pop through, or if you can get one of them, you can actually use the nut to tighten that, pull the other one in, and that's going to bolt up. But something you're going to want to take in consideration before you get this back on is going to be the fact that you need to mount your components up front. So I kind of planned this out by putting this up, figuring out the great spot to mount it, which you kind of have two options on the F-150. It's up to you. So with our center garnish in place, if your license plate is going to sit here, you're left with a small little gap here. You also have the plastic cover. And if you don't have adaptive cruise control, this can be a nice spot to notch that out, and you'll have a nice mounting plate that you can drill into here. The other option, again, is kind of using those brackets to mount here. It is going to get tight, especially because we're using the Air Force One braking system, so we do have to mount an air nozzle. Yours may be different depending on your installation, but make sure you plan out before you just put your bumper on, because otherwise you're going to have to feed these wires through. And that was a look and installation of the Blue Ox base plate on a 2016 Ford F-150.